All right, welcome back here to a very special episode of How to Survive Healthcare. Uh, as you know, the election was last week, and good, bad, or indifferent, Trump is coming back to be the president again. We're not going to dive into all of the cans of worms that will open. But one thing that I'm very excited about that I felt I really needed to bring here to the podcast is some of the initiatives that have been outlined in his work for Make America Healthy Again. So, his stance on healthcare is quite a bit different than what we saw with his first term. And guys, this is the level of high level federal involvement that we the people have needed for so long. So many of the issues that I have talked about on the podcast, uh, well, the hope anyways, we'll see what actually happens, but the goal is to actually tackle these issues at a high level. And that's what we need, because I have said over and over again, it is not fair to put the burden of figuring out how, like, what to do with your health, to put that burden on the consumer when all of the products around us are make it so difficult. So let me dive into this a little bit. So, the whole goal of the Make America Healthy Again movement is to prioritize chronic disease prevention and management, specifically with how it affects our children. We have seen alarming rates of serious allergies, infertility, obesity, respiratory diseases, autism, and autoimmune disorders. These are some of the things that he really wants. He's building out a cabinet to dig into why this is happening and what we can do at a governmental level to help avoid this. One of the people that he is planning to appoint is Callie Means. And Callie has been very outspoken about the issue of pesticides sprayed on our food. 99% of American farmland is sprayed with synthetic pesticides, and it doesn't get washed off before it gets into our food. You're eating the pesticides in processed packaged food. And we think this is probably part of the reason why, let's see. Here we go. Ultra processed food increases the risk of early mortality, early death by 18%. And we know that these pesticides that are sprayed, Monsanto, I'm looking at you, Roundup is one of the biggest ones. We know that they have toxic health effects, yet for some reason, the FDA and other administrations have been allowing it to be incorporated in our food. Just so you know, guys, these are not things that are allowed in other first world countries. This is an only in America problem. And I don't think that it's coincidental that America has some of the highest healthcare spending and poorest health outcomes when also compared to other first world countries. The food is a big part of the problem. I don't know if you're aware of this, but when back in I should have looked up the date, 50s, 60s, something like that, I encourage you to do your own digging on this. When they started really cracking down on the tobacco companies, those companies, they weren't going to just take their profit loss sitting down. They started to figure out what else they could do to shift and continue their revenue stream. And they started making food. The same people who figured out how to make tobacco and cigarettes so addictive started making food and started figuring out how to make food more addictive and make us sick, so that you eat the food, you get sick, you buy the medicines, and then you're a consumer in that pharmaceutical industry forever. And they make so, like, this is what we're talking about when you hear people talk about big pharma. It's and this is why I'm so passionate about saying how do you survive healthcare. Well, my number one tip is to avoid it and opt out as much as possible. Now, of course, if you're somebody who already has a chronic disease, you're probably going to have to interact with the healthcare system and take some sort of pharmaceuticals to manage that. But by and large, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's one of it works, tends to work better as well. I know I've said this before. There's nothing that you can put in your body that can undo the effects of what you have already put in your body. And unfortunately, so much of this starts with food. And we know that having a diet that is largely whole foods and plant-based is associated with significantly better outcomes than these ultra processed foods. If it comes out of a box or a package, it's really not food, it's a food like product. However, for a good portion of our nation, live in food deserts or places where fresh healthy food is just simply not accessible. If you're walking around in the city, they have gas. There's some people, I don't know if you know this, there are some people who cannot get to a grocery store. All they have is gas stations, and this is what we call food deserts. And those people, up until this point, have not been served by our government actually trying to tackle this issue. So, whatever you think about Trump and all of his policies, if we can put that aside for a second, the fact that we now are looking at an administration that is trying to tackle some of these biggest health issues that plague millions of Americans in our country. This is phenomenal. I am so stoked. They have intentions to go after and restructure some of the really key agencies, including the Department of Health and Human Services, the Center of Disease Control, the CDC, and the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Guys, the FDA does not have nearly the amount of power that you would probably think it does. In fact, the FDA is essentially bullied around by the activists and lobbyists that work for big pharma and the major processed food manufacturing companies. And that is exactly why we see so many things that are allowed in America that are not allowed in literally any other first world nation. For example, McDonald's French fries have, I think it's 13 ingredients here in America. They literally can't sell them that way in the rest of the world. And all of those extra ingredients, I mean, like, I can think of three that should be there, right? Like potatoes, oil, and salt. What are the other 10? They're preservatives that have already been shown to have negative health outcomes. And that's exactly why they're not allowed in all the other countries, but they make it different here because it can last longer and it makes it cheaper. That's just one example. Our food is pumped full of chemicals. I mean, are you looking at the wrappers? I also recently learned, this is a slight bit of a tangent, but I don't know if you've noticed, some food packaging now explicitly says on there contains genetically or derived from genetically modified food product. There are tons of food products that are genetically modified, but you'll never know it because the packaging only requires it to say that it's a genetically modified food product if a specific gene sequence can be found in it. So if your food is genetically modified, but it just doesn't have that one specific gene sequence, it doesn't even need to go on the labeling. There is such a lack of transparency in what is in our food and really what we are consuming and putting in our bodies. It's producing negative health effects. There's a massive lack of transparency right now, and this administration has announced that they're planning to go after that, and that is good news for everybody in America who eats food. In addition, they're trying to go after our drug prices as well. I think everybody knows the drug prices in this country are out of control. And it's not purely because of what it costs to make the drug. Again, we can't get into all the specifics. This will be a 3 hour long podcast. And we have people who do those already. That's too much. But if you actually look, like, start to pull the cost to the consumer, or what the insurance says it's going to cost, and how much of that money actually gets back to the manufacturer, the majority of what you're paying for a product just goes to the insurance company and the pharmacy benefit managers. And they have such predatory and confusing layering of the different pricing strategies. This is why it's so confusing what a drug will cost, how much it's going to cost. How many of you, have you ever had a situation where you went to get a drug and you weren't going to know what it was going to cost you until after you already got it? Like, that's mind-boggling. And we saw Trump trying to tackle some of this with his first presidency. In 2021, he put in the ruling that required hospitals to disclose prices, and that started the Price Transparency Act. Now, that was a great first step. Unfortunately, it didn't have the backing behind it to really be well enforced. If hospitals don't provide that information, the fine that they get, I think it's something like $300 a day. I mean, it's nothing. It doesn't matter. It's a slap in the wrist is honestly an overstatement. And there was it also didn't come with making the information in a way that was usable or accessible to the average consumer. So while it was a great first step, we need to see more for that, for it to actually be beneficial. But he's coming back to that, and I'm excited to see that move in the right direction too, because it's healthcare the state of healthcare in America right now, from the financial side. And I'm not talking about the people on the front lines taking care of you, your doctors, nurses, therapists, etc. I'm talking about all of the bloat around healthcare, the systems that are making millions of dollars off of your chronic illness every year. Those systems are not serving you. That money, whether it's coming out of your pocket, or it's raising insurance prices, or it's raising your taxes because it's getting covered by Medicare and Medicaid, which their states bailing out the insurance companies because of the messes they've got. It's a freaking mess. It's awful, and it's robbing you of your health. And it's done in such a way that most people aren't even aware of how bad it is. So, the fact that this grassroots mission from me and so many other health influencers across the nation is now our big message and goal is being taken all the way to the top, so that the average person such as yourself can finally start to get some real numbers, and somebody fighting for them, and what's good for our children. We have somebody fighting for them now and their health. Good things are coming from this. Transparency and cost reduction. Oh yeah, here's another thing that they're aiming for, is ending the corruption in regulatory agencies such as the FDA, and returning to the gold standard of evidence-based agents in medicine. In the late 80s, early 90s, science was booming. For a long time in medicine, the way that physicians practice medicine was really based on guesses and assumptions. There wasn't, you could go to, especially in like the 40s, 50s, you could go to a variety of different doctors and get a variety of different treatments. And they were really just kind of taking a shot in the dark on what had worked for them with patients before, but there wasn't this like overarching rigorous scientific study around disease and how we treat it. And that began to change in the 80s and 90s. And we started to see this emergence of what's called evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice meaning We've studied it in a lab and we have compared it against placebos. Ultimately, the best is with a double blind study where everybody involved in the study doesn't know if they're getting the actual treatment or if they're getting a placebo. So it removes bias and the science can speak for itself. Well, technology and innovation, as it does, just took off, and we started seeing a huge boom in the market of pharmaceuticals, like medications and also medical devices. Too many for the FDA to be able to keep up with thoroughly vetting all of them. So the FDA put this program into place where if you could prove that the device that you were trying to bring to market was really similar to something that was already passed by the FDA, then they didn't need to test it. It was fine. It could just be grandfathered in essentially. But what that has led to is we now have devices, and they've extended it to medications and vaccines, that the technology that's in this one sometimes is now 9, 10 generations away from the actual thing that had any kind of safety testing in the first place. And it reminds me of, what is that movie? But there was a movie also, I think, in the 90s where, they made a copy of a copy of a copy of copy. And when you got to number 4, it was a non-functioning human being at that point. It was a comedy. But the idea is, you can do the same thing with a sheet of paper. Make a copy of it 4 times, and the amount of degradation that you have at that fourth time, you have to have a fresh process every time. And we have gotten so far away from that in America, but you don't know that. They don't put that in the drug commercials. Drug commercials. That's another thing that may potentially be looked at. There's there's been a proposal for an end to direct consumer pharmaceutical advertisements. So that means stopping medication commercials on TV. Is that something you ever stop to think about? Probably not, because it's something that's so normal and embedded in our culture. But we're actually only one of 2 countries in the entire world that allows pharmaceutical advertising to consumers, to the average person. And the other country, I think it's New Zealand, maybe, they have a lot of rules and regulations about what can and can't be advertised. America doesn't. It's a free for all, and this just really goes to show you how much of a profit, how much profit there is there, how much money they are making off of you in these pharmaceuticals, if they're spending millions and billions of dollars to advertise it to you. Who do you think's paying for all of that? We are. Even if you're like, oh, Kayla, I'm not taking any medications. Okay, cool. Do you have health insurance? Because you're paying for all of that then. And that's why, one of the many reasons, health insurance costs so much. That's part of the reason people, it's insane how much health insurance costs. Then it's something like somewhere around 80% of people are functionally uninsured, meaning they have health insurance, but it still costs so much to go to the doctor or the provider because the amount you're paying every month, your premium is so high. And then on top of that, you're the out of pocket you have to pay is maybe another $7,000 a year, that even though you're carrying health insurance, you still can't afford to go to the doctor. Why do you even have health insurance? I don't. I'll be honest. I don't have health insurance. I take the money I was paying on premiums and I put it in a savings account every month. And when something comes up, we pay for it self pay out of pocket. Knock on wood, I hope that I never have a disaster, but it just doesn't make sense. I sat and did the math one day. We spent just me and my husband in the first 8 years that we were together and paying for our really crappy health insurance from our employer, by the way. We spent over $30,000 in premiums to go to the primary care once a year and get a dental cleaning. That doesn't make sense because we still had to pay for those things too. Like, it's bonkers. So it's high freaking time that somebody at the top is pushing back against this, because we, the people, need somebody to stand up for what we need out of our food system, our medication system, and our healthcare system, so that maybe we can finally start to return to some semblance of health. Because I don't know if you have stopped and looked around at your neighbors, we are not the picture of health. 74% of Americans right now are overweight. And don't misclassify this. This isn't fat shaming, but the science is very clear that the more extra weight we carry, the more at risk for other chronic diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure and high cholesterol, which those things also often lead to heart attacks and strokes and cancer. And the more weight we carry, the more at risk we are for those things. That's a huge part of the reason why we have so much chronic illness in America. That much is true. And for the longest time, the onus has been placed on the consumer to have to seek out the right foods, figure out what it is in the first place, because they don't actually teach it in school, because that food pyramid that they put out, it's not serving you. It's not helping. Nobody needs to be eating that much dairy. The overhaul is going to be good. I am tickled to see how this portion of the administration is going to play out. Oh, yeah, I didn't even touch on this yet, but they're also looking to tackle the issues with the supply chain and domestic production and bring the manufacturing of essential goods, medical goods, and medicine back to America. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, the dollars make sense. Bring jobs back to America, bring product manufacturing into America. But it's not just about the supply chain, it's also about the quality. So I don't know if you're aware, but roughly a third of drugs that are put out by big companies like Pfizer and AstraZeneca and whatnot are actually sourced and manufactured in third world countries with very little FDA oversight, because it's difficult to get into those facilities. But there has been an incredible amount of whistleblowers on the conditions in those facilities, and sterile practices not being followed, and the compounding not being done in the appropriate way. And it's not going through independent testing to make sure that the drug that's supposed to be in there is in there in the appropriate amounts, and that there's not impurities that could make us sick. That oversight is gone because, as I've mentioned before, the FDA it's incredibly small, and it doesn't have the funding and authority to be able to go after these big companies that are operating overseas. They just can't do it. They can't do it. So they're focused on the smaller companies here and the manufacturing plants here. And what that means is that these drugs, especially ones that are really hard to get right now, like Ozempic, because everybody wants that, they're just being pumped out in conditions that there's no safety checks around, but it comes in this really nice package. And oh, certainly something from a big reputable company like that, there's no way that it couldn't be safe. It would be phenomenal if we brought an end to that for the safety of America. I mean, there's recalls on, look at the food. I mean, they're recalling food products every single week for crazy amounts of lead and arsenic and other heavy metals. And that's not even talking about, again, the effects of the pesticides that's sprayed on literally all the food, because it's not just the things that are made out of corn, wheat, and soy that's grown this way. What do you think they're feeding the animals that we're then eating the animal products? the same processed crap. And unlike when if you eat a product that's made with GMO wheat, which wheat is in everything. That's what flour is made out of, and flour is the basis of like every grain product, crackers, bread, pasta, all that kind of stuff, the bottom of the old traditional food pyramid. All of that has the pesticide on it. And when you eat it, you get that one dose of pesticide that's in that product. But here's the thing about glyphosate, the pesticide that Monsanto uses, it accumulates in the body. And where we see the big implication, it's not in your body, it's in the body of the cows and the pigs, because they are also fed this, well, mostly corn, but the corn is grown in a similar manner. And when those animals eat the pesticide, they get that dose from the meal that they ate, and the next meal and the next meal and the next meal for the whole year or so that they're growing. And then it all gets stored in their body. So then when you eat that, you're getting this massive dose. It's called bioaccumulation of these pesticides. And then we wonder why we're seeing issues with all of our guts and hormones, because we're eating all of this crazy stuff is being pumped in our foods. And even some foods that you might they seem on the surface healthy, or maybe the packaging is really good, and it's just made the entire landscape incredibly difficult and confusing for consumers. And this is part of the reason why we're all sick. God, if we could just cut all of that away, that would be a huge win to everybody in America. And I've seen some of this myself. So when I was 18, I was diagnosed with a wheat allergy, which I thought was really weird. I thought you got food allergies as a kid. Well, turns out you can develop actually an allergy at any time in your life. I was diagnosed with a wheat allergy, and when I started eliminating wheat from my diet, I felt amazing. And I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess this is really it." Now, I worked on the theory. I was like, well, I could eat wheat for the majority of my life before I became allergic. Perhaps at some point I won't be allergic anymore. And I wasn't ever anaphylactic allergic. I had significant GI issues with it. So periodically from that point forward, I would, like once a year, try a little bit of a wheat based product and see if I had that kind of a gut reaction again. And eventually, when I was 25, 26, something like that, I started to be able to tolerate wheat again. And I slowly reintroduced it in my diet. Interestingly, about a year later, I found a graph of the amount of glyphosate that's Roundup, the weed killer that's sprayed on wheat. I found a graph of how much we were using in America over time. And lo and behold, the year that I got diagnosed with my wheat allergy was the year that use of that product spiked. And the year that I was able to tolerate wheat again, it was like 7 years later, is when it had finally decreased back down. So they have cut back on it a bit. I'd be so curious to see if anybody else found that to be true for them as well. But that just shows firsthand. I don't think I actually truly had a wheat allergy. I think my body was so sensitized to the effects of that glyphosate, but the glyphosate was always present with the wheat. So my body began to fight and identify that wheat protein as part of the problem, even though it truly wasn't. And by the way, guys, they're not allowed to make food that way in other countries. So, anyways, I'm going to end the rant. Somebody I may accuse me of spouting conspiracy theories, and I'm okay with that. But I do just want to leave you with this: it's not a conspiracy if it's true. And all these things I've shared about the food today, go look. The data is really clear on it. we just have never had an administration at such a high level really trying to do something about it at this level. Michelle Obama had a great initiative with trying to get healthy food to kids. That I don't remember the entire program off my head, but that was heading in the right direction. But it was still, we weren't looking. It's great to try to get the kids to make healthy choices, but why don't we get the companies that are making food to just stop putting the pesticides in it in the first place? Makes too much sense. Okay, guys, that's it for me from this week. This was slightly different than some of the stuff that I usually cover, but with this being so timely and relevant, I just really felt I needed to bring it to you. Please, I'd love to hear your feedback. Reach out. You can drop comments here, or you can find me at herdforlife.com. If this is something you're interested in trying to figure out more of how these things are affecting you personally, reach out and we can have a chat about that and perhaps try to get you steered on a better path. Because while I'm excited, of course, that policy is coming, we all know that policy takes time, and the first round's probably not going to be super effective and blah blah blah. But you got to start walking down. You got to start somewhere, and thank God we finally are. So I will be back next week with some more of our more regular programming. And thanks for listening. Take care, guys.